College football nerds here to talk about what the hell happened Oklahoma and LSU this Saturday. Two teams that maybe weren't expected to be as good as they have been in recent past. Obviously, LSU is going to have a drop off with all that attrition, but not expecting this kind of shock early on. We're going to talk about it. Let us know in the comments what you think is going on with these teams and can they recover in 2020 or is it going to be 2021 before we see any real light at the end of the tunnel for them? Let us know. So, Josh, I want to start with, let's start with Oklahoma. We talked before this. We were comparing notes that we were going to start with LSU, but let's start with Oklahoma. And I can compare it to LSU. Coming out of this weekend, it was news early that Oklahoma lost because it was the early game. But then everybody was on LSU with these 623 yards that they gave up to Mississippi State. One thing that stuck out to me, though, was, for all the yards they gave them up on 60 attempts. So 10 yards, roughly 10 yards per attempt. Skylar Thompson hit Oklahoma for 13.4 yards per attempt, which is way worse. Way worse. They had the same amount of production on 25 attempts, basically, in terms of moving the ball, yards, and points, and efficiency. That's really bad because Skylar Thompson is not going to light most defenses up. So there's some concerns here for Oklahoma. But I want you to put, and I hate this because we're going a little negative, but we're trying to put this into perspective to point out really what happened and why these are some really big concerns. So statistically, I've kind of led with that. I want you to unpack it even more, what we were discussing before we kicked off the record button in terms of some comparisons with Kansas State in their Arkansas State game. So why don't you roll with that?
And I like how you say a little bit negative. There's no way you can talk about this loss and not be quite negative. So, fair warning, put earmuffs on the children, that kind of thing. Skylar Thompson, 18 to 25, 334 yards, 13.4 yards per attempt. That's a terrifying number. As you said, Costello in Mississippi State on LSU gets a lot of sort of play, but he did it in 60 attempts. 3 yards per attempt better was Thompson in that game. He did not throw an interception. And we took some flack on this because we talked about, you can really see what the deal is with Kansas State, and I just don't think they're a very good team, and I forget exactly what the tweet was, and people are like, oh, you're going to take that back now? Because apparently Kansas State's not that bad. We talk about this a lot on this channel. You've got to be really careful to not, rubber bound when a team wins a game and say, well, I guess they're better than we thought they were. Sometimes they're better than you thought they were, and sometimes one team is just worse, and you've got to look at how each team is done against their other opponents and stuff like that and calibrate it. It's going to be a weird year with COVID, and people are going to have quick turnarounds, but it's not so simple. So with this game in Kansas State, you can't throw out the Arkansas State game. And against Arkansas State, Kansas State had, offensively, 5.4 yards per play. They had 374 yards total on 69 plays. Against Oklahoma, on just 51 plays, they had 400 yards, which is 7.8 yards per play. And we generally say if you're hitting 6.5 yards per play, you're really effective offensively. If you're at 7 or 8, you're what Oklahoma was the past couple years. You are dominating. And the key to me is they could not dominate Arkansas State. It was 5.4 yards per play in that game. So 2.5 yards per play, about 50% better production offensively than they were against Arkansas State. Now, I think the thing people miss is the defensive statistics for Kansas State. The Arkansas State game wasn't lost because the offense was awful. I mean, they were good. They weren't elite. They lost Arkansas State because they gave up 6.89 yards per play, 489 yards on 71 plays. Against Oklahoma, 517 yards on 76 plays, 6.8 yards per play. That is a slightly lower number than it was for Arkansas State. So basically, Oklahoma was as effective per play as Arkansas State was, and they were far less effective defensively against Kansas State than Arkansas State had been. And then the kicker was, like you said, Kansas State was very effective at scoring and efficient in scoring for the number of the yardage they had, and Oklahoma turned it over 4 times. So in that situation, and when you let all that pass out, that's how you lose a game 38-35. Oklahoma, turned the ball over, and like this gets to a point that I think we both have had, right? That when you have these kind of statistics and your defense at this level, you can outgain somebody 517 to 400 like Oklahoma did against Kansas State, and you can still lose a ball game if you have a certain number of turnovers because the other team is able to put up a ridiculous number of points on the board, even if you're outgaining them by some significant margin.
We're running to explain away a lot of craziness from 2020 this year because of COVID and because teams haven't had to practice. And it's been really, disjointed is the way we could describe the offseason. But Kansas State beat Oklahoma last year in almost the exact same way. Oklahoma got up on them, and then Kansas State just started scoring and never stopped. And Oklahoma could not stop them. So I've got this theory. I've had it for a while, and I want you to talk a little bit about whether or not you think there's merit there, and what why there might be merit there. I feel like a lot of these teams that run a lot of the supremely high octane offenses, and we've seen it with high talented teams, we've seen it with low talented teams. To me, we've seen enough examples of a pattern continuing to exist that when you run some sort of either an RPO spread or an air raid offense, whatever you have to do offensively in practice to get that scheme humming at a high level, I feel like it makes it impossible to also develop a top talented defense schematically. I feel like it's to the defense's detriment, and we see it time and time again. That's my theory. Tell me if I'm crazy, if I'm not crazy, and maybe talk about it a little bit.
I think it's almost impossible to call it truly crazy. When you think about some of the great offenses in recent years, there have been a couple, like Alabama and Clemson had some great teams. Now, even then they had their offensive issues. Alabama 2018 was a offensive phenom, beats Oklahoma, and they turn around and get torched. Oklahoma that year obviously was getting torched offensively. Clemson did not, but they didn't really run the same type of scheme that Alabama and Oklahoma were running, RPO and then air raid. You look at other air raid teams, and disciples from it. Texas Tech, when they were in Kingsbury, frequently got roasted. A lot of Mike Leach's teams have had real issues defensively, and when they haven't had issues defensively, usually the offense has not been up to snuff. Zone read teams seem to have the same issue. So, like when Auburn was in, offensive nirvana, like the Nick Marshall years, 2013, 2014, they were not a very good offensive football team. Or excuse me, defensive football team. And their defensive numbers were not good. Even in 2010, when they won the national title, defensively, they were just good enough to get enough disruption to win a game. And it was kind of shocking when that Oregon game, which was another high-octane team, ended up being a defensive slugfest because neither one of those teams was very good on defense. So I think there has to be something to it, right? I mean, at this point, there's no way you can look at all these stats and say that if you run that kind of style of offense that the defense can hold point. And I think to your theory, and we've discussed it enough, so I know that I agree with it. I think that I know like with Auburn, from people I've talked to, they run a lot of plays against air. And you run a lot of stuff where you're just trying to get clean looks. And we talked about it a number of times in a number of different ways. Those offenses a lot of times want to have the scout team have resistance, but enough resistance where the offense can run their play without disruption. So they get used to what it looks like to run it right. And they get really, really good offensively because they get used to completing that pass and hitting that, crossing route on time. Sometimes, like the LSU game last year with Oklahoma, you see glitches, or when they started off in Alabama a couple years ago, they play a team that can really disrupt the passer or something, and the timing gets off, and all of a sudden it falls apart because they're not used to disruption. But most of the time, that style of practice really just leads to the offense on just like autopilot executing at an extremely high level. The problem is, I think the defense doesn't get used to ever being in front of the play, and I think there may be something about not having contact. There may be something about not having a good, maybe just the players not being used to anticipating plays or creating disruption. I don't know, but it clearly seems to have some effect. And it's happened for years. And I'll say even like and another example, at UCF 2018, everybody wants them in the playoff. It's a shame they didn't get in 2017 and 2018. Their defense was not good. I mean, they were 49th in the country in yards per play allowed in 2018 in a bad conference. None of these high-octane teams, including, like you're saying, the G5s, and I'll say 2017, they beat Auburn. They were 74th in the country in yards per play allowed. They never are at a high enough level to be high playoff level teams. And there's just something about it. And it makes you wonder if Oklahoma is ever going to be able to get over that hump and to be a true national title caliber team, because you can't have this level of defense and ever probably win a playoff scenario, just because you're just too likely to lose games to anybody, much less an elite offense.
And we saw with Alabama the 2 years under Tua where they could score on everybody in the country. Yes, they suffered a lot of defensive injuries, but they weren't establishing depth with all those five-star players. Their defenses weren't anything to be truly feared like they were literally every other year in the Saban era. And Saban always feared moving to this scheme, and I think secretly or for some part of it, it was because he knew the defense would suffer. All right, LSU is a little different boat because they have had a great defense, but we went back and forth with LSU fans all offseason, and we really try hard to not sugarcoat things, but also not be jerks about it, because there's, we're not in here doing this to chase clicks and followers and fans, if it's at the expense of us being like brutally candid about what we see. But we're also not trying to like piss off every fan base in the world so nobody watches us except the masochists. But what we said all along was, LSU, look, we've followed SEC football enough. We've followed big-time football enough to know that not even Alabama has had this kind of attrition, both from a coaching standpoint and a personnel standpoint. Not even Alabama. And in the years that they've had anything resembling this, they had drop-off. Auburn, when they had drop-off after the 2010 season, it was significant. And so we weren't shocked by what we saw Saturday. Now, I'm a little higher on Mississippi State than you are, but for all the people that are now jumping on, piling on LSU, and LSU fans that are like finally seeing like maybe there was something to this, I will say that I think LSU is still a better team, and this is where we kind of disagree. I think they're a better team than maybe they showed Saturday. I think they stepped into the worst possible scenario where their biggest attrition, other than Joe Burrow, was collectively on the defense. And their best defensive player is a very late last-minute scratch. And they've got to face a Mike Leach air raid team. And Mike Leach is going to have his offense clicking day one, game one, because he's been doing it forever. I want you to talk about how you disagree with that, because you're a little lower on LSU. But also, before you do that, if LSU drew Mississippi State in Week 7 instead of Week 1 for the SEC schedule, do you think it would have gone a little differently?
So here's my issue with LSU in this game. So I think the thing that I differ more with you is I think Mississippi State's a reasonably good team with KJ Costello, but I don't think they should be that good. And we talked about this a lot in the offseason. LSU lost after COVID opt-outs and draft picks and all, a full third of their roster. They had more NFL draft picks off that team than any national champion, as far as we're aware, has ever had. No Alabama has ever lost that much. No Clemson has ever lost that much. And if Alabama or Clemson did lose as much as LSU did, they would have experienced really significant drop-off in the following team. And we've seen, Alabama and Clemson not reload to the same level. And given the COVID opt-outs and losing Shelvin and all that, basically meant LSU's front is in the same position Alabama's was at the end of last year, with more attrition than Alabama suffered last year. And it's not shocking that their defense looks as shaky as they do, just like Alabama's look shaky. I agree with you, they've walked into the wrong situation in Week 1, but I don't necessarily think it's that Mississippi State is so good as much as it was just a really bad matchup for a team with their situation. Bo Pelini transitioned to a 4-3 this year. Could not have been the worst timing, because the players you have in a 3-4 at D-end are guys that are natural DTs, like Glenn Logan. And what that meant is the depth at D-end went to nothing. Now, Farrell is a solid player, but he's always been a role player, and he's not a great fit at D-end in a 4-3 because he's not disruptive. He's a little bit too big to play that position as an effective player. Gay flashed a little bit But Gay, there's a reason he hasn't played more as a junior, and it's simply the fact that he's not an elite player. And if you're relying on a 320-pound DN in a 4-3 scheme and a guy that's not an elite player to generate a pass rush, you're not going to get much. What does that result in? It results in them using guys like Damone Clark and Jacoby Stevens all over the field. Damone Clark flashed a lot. I think he's probably, without outside Stingley, he's probably the next best player on the defense. A lot of people talked about Stevens, but I actually felt like Clark made a bigger impact in the game from all the things he did. But they're being forced to rush the passer, forced to overextend themselves to accommodate the fact that the front four is not getting any disruption naturally. And that leaves one-on-ones across the rest of the board. So when you play an air raid team that can isolate your guys one-on-one, you cannot rush the passer naturally. Now Mike Leach gets to call crossing routes. And by the way, your top corner's out. So you've got a guy that was a lower division level corner that's now having to play one-on-one against an SEC receiver, and he gets burned or torched. And when they complete those passes, and Costello made a lot of mistakes, but he made enough good plays that they turn into big plays because you got a guy like Kylan Hill one-on-one, and if he catches it in stride, he's going to keep running. It was the lack of linebackers and safeties dropping back in coverage to me that was the important thing. That was due to the lack of pass rush. LSU's lack of pass rush and lack of dominance on the front four will be an issue the entire season. And I think that's the thing that's going to define LSU's defense, and I think it's the lack of depth there that is going to hold them back for the remainder of the year.
There's a lot of craziness and a lot of teams that are going to lose for whatever reason, either not have enough players that can dress or just practice disruption, whatever. But a lot of those teams are going to be mid-level pedigree and not the name brands that Oklahoma and LSU are. If you're looking at like the schedules for these two teams, is it almost safe to say that Oklahoma can still salvage a pretty good season, but LSU is probably between the two in a little more trouble, given that LSU's got 3 or 4 teams on their schedule right now that are better than the team that just beat them? For example, I'll kind of tack onto that. Could you see a Missouri in 2 weeks giving them fits?
Yes, I think, not to say they'd necessarily beat them, but the zone read scheme with Sean Robinson at quarterback could absolutely give LSU some major issues.
So this year, if we're looking at the outlook, do you think Oklahoma has a better outlook for this year?
I do. And like, to take it a step further, right? Oklahoma, they've got to play Texas. We don't know how good Texas is. We don't quite know how good Oklahoma State is. I think Oklahoma could be in trouble with any team given how bad the defense is. I will say, I felt like, Oklahoma was in total control of Kansas State. I think a lot of it was they got up a ton. The defense was not good enough to put it away, and particularly Rattler just looked shell-shocked when he realized he was in a real game and he had pressure on him, and he was a totally different player. They're going to figure some of that out. They're going to realize, for example, Rattler was far more effective rolling the pocket and throwing on the run and being creative versus when he was in the pocket, and they're going to scheme that. I thought he was Mahomes-like at times, and they're going to figure out a way to make that work. The defense isn't going to be great, and they may drop another game, but I think they're more than capable of beating everybody on their schedule. And, again, nobody else there looks like a world beater. LSU's problem is twofold. One, we've already talked about the defensive issues, but two, their schedule is a heck of a lot harder. Like you said, even 2 weeks from now against Missouri is a sneakily good team under Drinkwitz. I think they're actually pretty competent. They're not great. I'm not saying Alabama beat the best team in the world last week or anything like that, but there are signs that they're functional. And I don't think Mississippi State's a great team. And Missouri is a lot better on the offensive line and defensive line than Mississippi State, which, again, that's where LSU should have been dominating the game. And then when you get into games like Florida, Auburn, Alabama, the difference to me is Oklahoma was mostly winning the line of scrimmage and then just screwing up sometimes. They're giving up yards on the pass. That can be kind of ironed out. I think LSU is deficient at offensive line and defensive line. They gave up a lot of sacks. They ran the ball pretty well against Mississippi State, but let's be honest, Mississippi State was 11th in the conference last year in rush defense. That's not a good defense, and they weren't any more effective. Those line issues for LSU, particularly against the level of competition they're going to play, are going to make it really hard to be overly successful in a number of games this year. I pegged them. I think I want to say it was a 6-4 record that I had them at once we knew what the schedule was. We already had them as I think like a 2 or 3 loss team in their preview. It's impossible for us to keep track of, guys. I'm sorry, it was months ago, and the schedule's changed like 8 times since that point. But yeah, I still am at that point. The schedule is way too hard, and the line problems are way too tough for LSU. Whereas Oklahoma can kind of make do with their problems, I think LSU's problems are a lot more systemic, a lot more talent-based, and not something that can be readily fixed.
Yeah, and we also have a mental factor here. We've seen this with LSU teams in the past where they have a loss and they have championship aspirations, they have a loss, and they mentally fall off and lose to teams they shouldn't. Now they're probably not as good as the teams that are potentially going to beat them. But then combine that with the fact that they have a loss this early after the season they just had, and they have that championship mentality, I could see it going sideways and them losing to teams that they are better than on both sides of the ball. They do get Stingley back, which is going to be a huge boost, but I have concerns at quarterback. And I saw a lot of people saying after this game that this is Miles Brennan's first start, and he had the unfortunate circumstance of starting against an SEC team. But look, we saw Bryce Young play Saturday against an SEC team, a better defense, frankly, and look far more poised and confident with his throws and making decisions. I mean, did you see the same thing? I mean, if you're going to compare the two, because one guy's been at a school for 4 years and been in a system for 3 years, and the other guy didn't even get spring practice. Like, to me, it was pretty stark.
There's absolutely no comparison between the two from what I saw, having watched pretty much all of both games. Bryce Young right now is a much better quarterback than Miles Brennan, and it was very unrealistic for anyone to think that Joe Burrow could be replaced with any level of quality. Some people talked it up and tried to make an excuse like, well, it was really Ensminger is the same offensive coordinator, and we brought in this new quarterback guru, et cetera, et cetera. You had a genius in Brady making your third down play calls, and you had a transcendently good quarterback who's showing in the NFL that he was as good as advertised and as good as everyone thought he was. You cannot lose first-round draft pick level talent from any team and not feel it. You just can't replace those guys immediately. Bryce Young looks like a future first-round draft pick quarterback. Miles Brennan looks like a mild-level draftable quarterback. The difference is stark. And to your point, and I already made the point about the rush defense, this is the thing that really concerns me. Mississippi State was the worst pass defense in the conference, 8.7 yards per attempt last season, 246 yards per game.
And lost guys.
Like, this was maybe the easiest test you were going to get. And maybe Leach just coached them up a lot, but I kind of doubt it. And that's the thing that is so concerning if you are LSU, is it's not just you lost the game, but again, you put Mississippi State in your top 10. I did not. I don't believe that Mississippi State took the worst pass defense in the conference and made them good. I think it's quite likely they are still quite bad, which means this LSU output for 34 points is a pretty good number of points in the game. Granted, it took, 80-something.
27 offensive points.
Yeah, 27 offensive points on 84 plays, right? I don't think this offense is good enough to score more than 20 points in some of their games against big opponents. I think teams are going to be much better defensively than Mississippi State. And I mean, what do you do? I mean, there's not a lot of ways to get around it. I just think LSU is in serious trouble offensively, and given the defensive issues, which I think they'll get fixed somewhat, but the front four is not going to get fixed on defense. They're just, it's going to be a multi-loss team. It's going to be like a 5-5, 6-4 team, and I don't really see any way around it.
We should have put up some sort of trigger warning at the beginning of this video. We left a lot of blood on the floor. Sorry for you Oklahoma and LSU fans that hung with us for this long. But look, I mean, once you get past the national championship aspirations, or the thought that, this is going to be a similar year to last year with a little bit of drop off, and then start seeing it as it is, and that is a rebuilding year. Once you see it for that, and not have any other view of it, then you can appreciate and enjoy player development throughout the year, improving defense throughout the year, and look towards next year. So I don't think it's all as lost this year for either one of these teams, especially Oklahoma, who could still beat Texas. They just gave up 56 to Texas Tech. You just need to have a candid view of where your team is and where it needs to go. That's it for us on this one. Thanks so much for hanging out this long. Give us a comment or two on what you think these teams' outlooks are going to be for the rest of the year. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.